It's great to have you all with us for this final in our series of Lent Talks, exploring God's story, our story. Everything that we've thought about in previous weeks has been about the telling of a story, the story of salvation, the story of a community, how we tell a story through worship, and the story of our faith journeys. Today's going to be rather different because it's about listening. Now, that's obviously not to exclude people who are hard of hearing. And by listening, I simply mean receiving what's told to us in whatever way, whether through our ears or any other medium. So why should we listen at all? Well, one of the people who normally joins us on Zoom for these Lent talks is missing tonight because he's a volunteer with the Samaritans. He would be able to say much better than I can how important listening is. We all know when we've been heard, and when we're heard, we know that we've been valued. We also know, of course, when we haven't. Now, I don't know about your households, but in mine, there can sometimes be issues when people are multitasking, especially when they're playing on their mobile phones and you're talking to them and they say, oh, yes, yes, or no, no. And you know, absolutely, they haven't got a clue what you're saying. So you could say, would you like to give me £1 million? And they'll say, oh, yes, yes. And so it goes on. Let me see what we can do to catch them out. Well, listening is hugely, hugely important in our faith as well, because we grow in our faith, not just through the telling of our own stories, but also by hearing the stories of other people. By listening to their stories, we can be inspired and in turn given confidence to tell our own. Last week, when the Dean was giving a talk on personal stories, it was intriguing to see how challenging many people found that and how difficult it was, even when people went into quite small groups, for people to tell each other very much about themselves personally. I have to tell my story of faith many times. It's one of those things when you go through the ordination process that you're forced to tell your story of faith, and I'm proud to do so. But I'm conscious that whenever I do tell it, I adapt it to the audience of people listening. Not because it's not true, not because I'm making things up, but because actually different parts of it will connect with different people. And of course, it's still evolving. I wonder whether some people feel hampered in telling their story because they think it ought to fit a particular pattern, that there ought to be some kind of dramatic conversion experience involved. And if that's not there, it's not quite right. Well, of course, that's not the case. But I'd like to tell you a conversion story, a famous one from Christian tradition. And this is the conversion of Saint Augustine, one of the great writers of the early church. He's often dismissed these days as being a bit of an unpleasant character and a bit of a misogynist. He wasn't really that bad, or at least he wasn't as bad as some of his contemporaries were, which maybe isn't saying that much. But he was a great understander of the human condition and how we relate to God. And in his writings, he gives two totally different accounts of his own conversion, his own awakening to Jesus Christ. The famous one appears in a book called The Confessions, and it's a sudden event that happens one day. The other account is revealed through some of his more philosophical writings. And what that shows is a much more slow and gradual awakening to the Christian faith. For most Christians, there isn't a dramatic conversion experience. It's wonderful if that has been your experience, but for most of us, it much more fits with that sense of slow and gradual awakening, which is lifelong. That's certainly the case for me. And I would say it's still going on for me today. So I'm still in the process. Yes, I have faith. Yes, I go to church. But that faith is still growing and deepening. And I hope that tomorrow I will be a better Christian than I am today. Now, Augustine's sudden conversion probably never happened as he wrote it in his Confessions, but that doesn't mean that that account doesn't contain some bigger truths. The setting is in a garden. He hears a voice of a child, and the text says, quite strangely in a way, that he wasn't sure whether it was the voice of a boy or a girl. Perhaps we're meant to think that it was the voice of an angel. And this voice says to him, pick up and read, pick up and read. And the only book that's available to him in the garden to read is a book of the Bible, the letter of Paul to the Romans. So he picks up and reads, and there he encounters Christ. It's very unlikely that this happened in a literal sense, but the truth is much deeper. The truth is not so much about gardens or children, but rather that Augustine's faith, his Christian faith, is awakened by listening to God, listening to the voices of the faithful people around him, represented perhaps by that child, and listening to or reading the Bible. So with that in mind, I wonder how it is that we listen to God and listen to God's story. I suppose, most obviously, we do it through prayer. And if we're reticent about telling the stories of our faith, I suspect that we're also probably reticent about talking about how we pray. It's something very private, and often we just don't have the words. But again, I also wonder if some people feel that their prayer lives ought to fit some kind of particular pattern. And that because it's private, because we don't talk about it an awful lot, they might worry that they aren't praying somehow properly, whatever that means. Now, of course, I would argue there isn't any such thing as praying properly, and all we can do is what comes naturally. You can light a candle if it helps you focus. You can talk to God if you want to. But most of all, prayer is just about being still and quiet and listening. And it's in that moment of silence and of listening, that God holds us. God tells us his story, and God deepens our faith. So we listen to God, but we listen to other people as well, just as Augustine listened to the voice from over the wall. Now, my neighbours, or one of my neighbours anyway, Liz, next door to my family home in Liverpool, is an absolute saint. There are no angelic voices crossing the garden wall into her garden, I'm afraid, only tennis balls hit by my children. And without fail, she always throws them back. But there is that kind of to and fro over the garden wall. And in the same way, there can be something deeply practical about communicating our faith, not just through words, but also through our actions, and again, through our listening. So the people who have most inspired me, who have inspired me by their Christian stories, have never actually sat me down and given me a blow-by-blow account of how they came into a deeper relationship with Christ. Instead, they're people like Abby. She was a parishioner when I was in an early stage of my ministry. And without anybody knowing, she did all the washing for her elderly neighbour who couldn't do it for herself. She just got on with it. And as an incredibly self-giving act, people who've inspired me have been people like Luke, who was a young person full of questions, interested and excited by faith, who would keep me on my toes. They've been people like Cynthia, another parishioner, who had the toughest life you could possibly imagine, but she always wanted to thank God for the small things that she had. These are the people who have inspired me, people who have simply lived out their story of faith rather than always telling it with words. Our first Lent group, in the small Lent groups that have been taking place parallel to these talks, began with the parable or story of the Good Samaritan. And that's a story which ends with a challenge from Jesus to go and do likewise. So I think our challenge today is to tell our stories by all means, but also to listen and to live out God's story of salvation in the world. And so before we break into our groups, there are two questions that I would like you to consider. The first of those questions is, whose stories have inspired you or deepened your faith, and why? They may be people in the Bible, they may be historical figures like St. Augustine, they may be people who you have met or who you know well, or members of your family, but whose stories have inspired you or deepened your faith? And then secondly, how can you live out the story of salvation?